Georgia frontier during the darkest years of the American Revolution. A group of armed loyalists pushes into a log cabin near the Broad River. They expect food. They expect fear. They do not expect Nancy Hart. According to the story that Georgia has repeated for generations, Hart welcomes the men, feeds them, gives them drink, and waits until they become careless. One by one, she begins passing their guns through a gap in the cabin wall. When a loyalist notices, she turns a weapon on them. One man moves, she shoots him. Another is wounded. The survivors are held at gunpoint until help arrives. Later versions say they are hanged outside the cabin. It is one of the most famous stories of a woman fighting during the American Revolution. It is also a story recorded mainly through later tradition rather than contemporary military documents. That does not make Nancy Hart imaginary. It makes her more interesting. Because behind the cabin legend stands a real frontier patriot remembered as a spy, fighter, healer, marksman, and relentless enemy of Georgia's loyalists. The challenge is separating the woman from the myth without destroying either. Nancy Ann Morgan Hart was probably born around 1735, though some traditions place her birth closer to 1747. Even the location is uncertain. North Carolina and Pennsylvania both appear in later accounts. That uncertainty follows her through nearly every stage of her life. She married Benjamin Hart and eventually moved with her family into Georgia's Broad River frontier, in territory that later became Elbert and Hart counties. This was not a settled countryside protected by dependable roads and courts. It was a violent borderland. Families lived far apart. Militia service was local and irregular. Patriot and Loyalist communities often knew one another personally. The revolution in Georgia did not remain a clean contest between uniformed armies. It became a civil war fought through raids, ambushes, arrests, confiscations, revenge, and shifting control of isolated settlements. Nancy Hart's home stood inside that conflict. Later descriptions present her as physically imposing, tall, red-haired, strong, rough-spoken, cross-eyed, and an excellent shot. Those details became part of the traditional image, but the exact measurements and appearance come from memory and folklore rather than a surviving portrait. What remains consistent is reputation. Neighbors remembered someone difficult to intimidate. She hunted. She handled firearms. She knew the surrounding country. She treated injuries and illness. Most importantly, she was remembered as an active patriot rather than a passive observer. The Georgia Revolution gave her many opportunities to become one. In 1778, British forces captured Savannah and began rebuilding royal authority in the colony. Loyalist militia expanded. Patriot officials and fighters were driven into the backcountry or across borders. The following year, the Patriot victory at Kettle Creek prevented a major Loyalist force from safely reaching British lines, but it did not end the civil conflict. British occupation, Patriot resistance, and local retaliation continued. The Broad River region became dangerous for anyone whose political loyalty was known. Hart's husband and relatives were connected to Patriot activity. Traditional accounts claim Nancy served as a spy for Georgia partisan leaders such as Elijah Clark. One famous version says she disguised herself as a man, entered Loyalist camps, listened to conversations, and returned with intelligence. No surviving mission report proves those episodes in detail, but the spy tradition fits the frontier environment. A woman moving between households, markets, camps, and roads might attract less suspicion than an armed male courier. Hart's knowledge of local families and terrain would have made her useful. The same traditions claim nearby indigenous people called her War Woman, or a related name later attached to Wahachie Creek. The linguistic and documentary foundation of that claim is uncertain, but the title became inseparable from her public memory. The revolution on this frontier produced precisely the kind of figure who could become a legend. There were few official records. Many actions were small. Stories traveled orally through families. Decades later, local writers gathered those memories after eyewitnesses had died. Every retelling sharpened the dialogue, increased the danger, and made the ending more dramatic. The cabin confrontation became the center of Hart's story because it contains everything a legend needs: a familiar domestic space. Invaders who underestimate a woman, food and drink used as deception, hidden weapons, a sudden reversal, justice delivered without waiting for formal authority. The usual version begins when 5, 6, or 7 Loyalists arrive at Hart's cabin. The number changes depending on the source. Some accounts say they have killed one of her turkeys and demand that she cook it. Others say they are searching for a patriot. Hart allows them inside. She serves food and liquor while watching them lean their muskets against the wall. She sends a daughter toward a spring with instructions to signal Benjamin Hart and nearby patriots. Then she begins moving the guns out of reach. When the Loyalists discover what she is doing, the trap closes. Hart aims one of their own weapons. She warns them not to move. One ignores her and is shot. Another is wounded. The survivors are held until Patriot men arrive. According to later tradition, the captives are hanged rather than shot because Hart insists that shooting is too honorable. It is a brutal ending. It also reflects the Civil War violence of the Southern backcountry, where captured partisans could be executed outside conventional military process. But we must be exact about what can be claimed. The New Georgia Encyclopedia describes the episode as revolutionary lore. Georgia historical markers repeat it as tradition. The account became widespread long after the war. No contemporary court record, military report, diary, or newspaper has been found that confirms the full sequence. So the responsible conclusion is not that the story definitely happened exactly as told. It is that generations close enough to the frontier remembered Nancy Hart as a woman capable of doing it, and physical evidence later gave the tradition an eerie second life. In 1912, workers grading land near the traditional Hart cabin site reportedly uncovered several human skeletons. Some were said to have broken necks or positions consistent with hasty burial. Local residents connected the discovery to the captured Loyalists. Modern archaeological documentation was limited, and the remains cannot now be identified with certainty. The find does not prove the cabin legend. It explains why the legend became even harder to dismiss. If you value stories that preserve drama without confusing tradition with evidence, subscribe. Hart's cabin made her famous, but her larger importance comes from the kind of war that allowed such a story to grow. Georgia's revolution was exceptionally unstable. The colony had a smaller population and a stronger Loyalist presence than several northern states. British forces repeatedly occupied major towns. Patriot governments operated under pressure. Militia units formed, scattered, and reformed around local leaders. The same family could contain patriots, loyalists, neutrals, and people whose allegiance changed according to survival. Women carried enormous burdens in that environment. They protected farms while men served. They hid food and weapons. They carried messages. They treated wounded fighters. They faced raids from both sides, yet military histories often recorded only the men listed on official rolls. Nancy Hart survived because the community refused to let her disappear from memory. That memory may include other episodes. One story says she encountered a Loyalist spy peering through a crack in her cabin wall and threw boiling soap into his face before capturing him. Another says she shot a Tory across a river. Another places her near the Battle of Kettle Creek. The New Georgia Encyclopedia notes that she was reportedly present at the battlefield, but surviving evidence cannot establish a specific combat role. These stories should not be stacked together as though each were independently documented. They are pieces of a reputation. Every frontier story asks the same question: what happens when a dangerous enemy underestimates Nancy Hart? The answer is always that Hart sees the danger first, acts faster, and turns the enemy's confidence against him. That pattern tells us how local Georgians understood her. She represented vigilance in a landscape where official protection was unreliable. Her home was not merely a private space. It could become an intelligence post, hospital, supply point, or battlefield. Her domestic tools could become weapons. Her familiarity with local roads could become military advantage. Her social invisibility as a woman could become concealment. This is why the title, "The Woman Who Captured Her Own Enemies," works even with careful hedging. According to the central legend, Hart captured armed Loyalists inside her own cabin using their weapons. The reversal is more important than the exact number. They entered believing they controlled the space. They became prisoners in it. Hart's post-war life is less dramatic and almost as uncertain. After the Revolution, she and Benjamin appear to have remained in Georgia for a period. Benjamin died sometime around the war's end or afterward, with dates differing across traditions. Nancy later moved with family members toward Kentucky, settling in the Henderson County region. She reportedly lived into old age and died around 1830. Her grave location is traditionally identified in Kentucky, though details remain debated. By the 19th century, Georgia's memory of Hart had expanded far beyond the cabin site. Hart County, created in 1853, was named for her. It remains the only Georgia county named for a woman. The county seat became Hartwell. A creek, highway, schools, organizations, and military groups took her name. During the Civil War, women in LaGrange organized a female militia company called the Nancy Harts. They drilled with firearms and prepared to defend the town. That later organization demonstrates how Hart's image functioned. She was not remembered merely as a victim who survived. She was remembered as someone who armed herself before help arrived. The legend also became part of American popular culture. Paintings show Hart aiming a rifle at red-coated or Loyalist intruders. Children's histories simplify the uncertainty. Tourism materials turn the cabin into a clear, heroic location. Each retelling risks replacing history with certainty, but removing the legend entirely would also distort the past. Folklore is evidence, not always evidence that an event occurred exactly as described, but evidence of what a community chose to preserve. Georgia chose to preserve Nancy Hart as a defender of home, independence, and frontier justice. That memory emerged in a society that usually limited women's public authority. The contradiction matters. Hart could be celebrated for violence during a revolutionary emergency, while ordinary women remained excluded from voting, office holding, formal command, and most legal independence. Her heroism was treated as exceptional rather than as proof that women's political capacity was ordinary. The same society that turned Hart into a symbol did not redesign itself around women like her. There is another contradiction. Patriot memory often presents Hart's cause as simple liberty. But revolutionary Georgia was a slave society. Patriot victory protected political independence while leaving human bondage intact. Women's courage, black military service, Loyalist resistance, indigenous sovereignty, and frontier violence all existed inside that larger reality. Hart's story should not be used to make the Southern Revolution cleaner than it was. It should help us see how personal the conflict became. Enemies did not always arrive in distant formations. Sometimes they crossed a familiar threshold and demanded dinner. Sometimes the battlefield was a kitchen. Sometimes a political decision had to be made before neighbors arrived to help. Today, a replica of Hart's cabin stands near the traditional site in Elbert County. Historical markers identify the landscape. Hart County continues carrying her name. Visitors looking for a fully documented military biography will find frustrating gaps. There is no complete service record, no collection of wartime letters, no authenticated portrait painted from life, no contemporary written account of the famous cabin confrontation. What survives is a mixture of geography, family tradition, public commemoration, later historical writing, and a woman's extraordinary reputation. That mixture requires discipline. Say according to tradition when the evidence is traditional. Say reportedly when the event is plausible but unproved. Do not turn 6 Tories into a confirmed number. Do not present every hanging, gunshot, disguise, or battlefield appearance as documented fact. Then ask what remains after the caution. A frontier woman known for patriot loyalty, a skilled user of firearms, a figure remembered as a spy, a household placed directly in the path of Loyalist violence, a local tradition so durable that Georgia named a county after her, a cabin story whose basic reversal has survived for more than 2 centuries. Nancy Hart may never be separated completely from legend. That is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The revolution produced official generals whose movements survive in hundreds of letters. It also produced local fighters whose lives survive because families repeated their names beside fireplaces and graveyards. Hart belongs to the second history, the history of war remembered from inside homes. The Loyalists entered her cabin expecting obedience. The legend says they left it as prisoners. Whether every detail occurred exactly as later generations told it cannot be proved. What can be proved is that Georgia remembered Nancy Hart as the woman no armed enemy should have underestimated. If this story was worth watching, subscribe and tell us in the comments which overlooked woman of the American Revolution should come next.